Welcome to the Healthcare Nation podcast. I'm your host, Rick Janata, and we're committed to bringing you thought leaders in the field to discuss what's new and noteworthy in the health sector. This is the Healthcare Nation podcast. This is a continuation of our series really on innovation in the health sector. We're focusing now more on data analytics and biotech, medtech, and pharma, and I'm so pleased to have Stan Miele with us from AQUALUNG Therapeutics. And Stan is a distinguished global executive, a wealth of experience. I've known Stan for many years in the pharma, med, tech, and device space. He's been in leadership roles in sales, marketing, P&L, in those industries across the board. He was formerly Chief Commercial Officer at Biolytical Laboratories and President at Sucampo Pharmaceuticals. And he was instrumental in some key licensing agreements for Sucampo as well, which included the agreement with Abbott in Japan and also Takeda Pharmaceuticals. And now he's leading up the execution and development of manufacturing and really the commercialization process for AQUALUNG, which is, I would say, further along than a startup. And we're going to hear about that journey and the acceleration from pipeline and platform to commercialization. Stan, thank you so much for joining us today on Healthcare Nation podcast. Great to see you, my friend. What's new and noteworthy in the universe of Stan Miele?
Well, Rick, first, it's an honor and real pleasure to reconnect with you again. And I'm humbled to be part of your Healthcare Nation podcast and YouTube channel and the like. But boy, that's quite the question to just get things kicked off. I've been up to quite a bit. So where should I begin?
What you're perhaps up to right now with AQUALUNG. I'm keenly interested in this. Obviously, everything that's happening in the health sector, but particularly pharma. And I'm very, at this time anyway, bullish on pharma across the board. So why don't we start there? Then I'm going to probably dial the clock back a little bit.
I know you, and fortunately, you have a very strong critical care background, even prior to sort of some of your leadership roles. And AQUALUNG Therapeutics is really, from my perspective, I would say it's almost like an amalgamation of everything that I've been trying to do for the last 30 plus years within the pharma, biotech, medical device arena. And AQUALUNG itself is a biotech company that's focused on two primary areas, one being that of runaway or unchecked inflammation, and the other is that of fibrosis. It's an early stage company that's transitioned from preclinical now to clinical. And so we're very active in the clinic and looking forward to move through our clinical trials and get this therapeutic across the finish line.
That is so exciting. And I want to get back to that, the entire journey, but let me frame it out. You've had such a phenomenal career, Chief Commercial Officer at Biolytical, President at Sucampo. I mean, really tremendous, in addition to just what you've done in the P&L space in the pharma and medtech area. When you think about that experience and what you're doing right now with AQUALUNG, are there still the same significant challenges that folks would have faced, let's say, years ago, or is it more challenging today? How is the environment unfolding for you as, let's say, a relatively new startup in the pharma space?
Well, I think the challenge is they evolve and they shift on a daily basis. I would say right now, the most pressing issue facing not only AQUALUNG, but certainly early stage biotech companies has to do with capital raise. And I think it goes without saying, and this isn't just a byproduct of what happened most recently with Silicon Valley Bank. I think this has been something that's been in motion for the last 18 to 24 months. And specifically, if we, some of the data, I mean, there's a lot of good data points. RBC had a report and all these reports, when we look at literally in the first quarter of 2023, no more than 60 early stage biotech companies actually closed their Series A.
I think about how the sector, particularly for the startups, and we go back many months, there was just plenty of cash available for so many, let's just say, good ideas. But those good ideas would have never been funded 5-10 years ago. They just wouldn't have made it. And there was a lot flowing. And what I'm hearing with you is I think that securing funding in every possible way, it wouldn't be possible if there wasn't merit to what you were doing. I mean, you just do not go into NIH and BARDA and some of these other areas and look at really leveraging those kind of inroads to access to capital unless there's a there.
That's absolutely correct. And I think you really framed it as well as anyone could, because I think as we're looking at the current capital raise environment, the days of quote unquote hype are over. We need substance, right? And substance comes in many different sizes and shapes, right? And whether it's having the preclinical data, is it published preclinical data? Has it been substantiated and funded to some degree by government entities such as the NIH? And so I think that, again, if we circle back to AQUALUNG, we have been very fortunate because the scientific thesis from our perspective has been thoroughly validated and vetted to probably the nth degree.
Yeah, that confidence and stability, I mean, it sends more than a message. I think it really is something that it's rarer space than what we've seen some months back. Let me switch to the clinical side of things and clinical development specifically. We both know this is a critical milestone for any startup that's certainly in the healthcare space, in the sector along those lines. Are there new and unique challenges with what you're doing with AQUALUNG that perhaps you didn't face years ago? Are there things, including, insights that you've picked up with respect to clinical development and the criticality it plays in terms of hitting milestones that are different?
Great question. I would say, Rick, from personal experience specifically relating to AQUALUNG, a lot of that has to do with, I would say, the personalized or predictive medicine approach. And when I say that, if we look at our lead indication for the therapeutic drug, we call our therapeutic monoclonal antibody ALT-100. Okay, it's a humanized monoclonal antibody that is designed to address a specific protein and a target that is a master regulator of unchecked inflammation and fibrosis. And interestingly enough, when we look at the clinical development phase of this drug, we've had some frequent and early interaction with the FDA. And one of our discussions centered around, well, should we really highlight the biomarker use of this therapeutic? And do we need a companion diagnostic as an example? And until that's all validated, I think the FDA takes a bit of a hands-off or a step back approach, right? Until you've actually validated the diagnostic and you have a strong body of evidence to support this. But I think directionally, from our perspective and what I see, clearly we've seen this is very well developed in the oncology space. I mean, they are by far the most advanced at selecting biomarkers. It's precision medicine. It's very targeted. This hasn't been really the general notion when we look at other general indications across the spectrum. And our lead indication being of acute respiratory distress syndrome, it was almost like a foreign language in discussing this with the FDA, because any patient that comes in that's been septic or they've had various concerns that have led to them, or injuries that have led to them being on mechanical ventilation, it's sort of an all hands on deck, and then they throw everything at them. But the goal, quite frankly, is from our perspective, is we want to make sure that our drug works on the right patient at the right time. And I think from a regulatory and a clinical development perspective, this is the key.
Just knowing what I do about the profile of AQUALUNG and what you're pursuing, I can't help but go to the pandemic and COVID and the pulmonary, constellation of clinical events that happened clearly with COVID. Was there any acceleration with respect to the application process or linkage to COVID-19 with AQUALUNG that helped you accelerate the process, or at least the clinical development? And my second part to that is, how about with respect to indications?
There absolutely was. We met with the FDA sort of in the height of the pandemic, and we were still actively engaged in our pre-IND small and large animal tox work and working out the PK profile and everything of the therapeutic drug, checking all those necessary boxes to get the drug across the finish line to file the IND. But we did file the IND during the pandemic, and with our lead indication being that of acute respiratory distress syndrome, which can be derived from sepsis, viral bacterial pneumonia, and or severe COVID-19, right? That's the patients who sadly succumbed to their injuries with COVID. They all had acute lung injury, massive unchecked inflammation, the cytokine storm, which everyone read about. Nobody knew much about this prior to COVID. But due to the filing of some of our discussions with the FDA during the pandemic, what typically can take 90 days, that gets accelerated to 30 days. You have the interaction with the FDA. So all of our timeline then began to accelerate. And our only dilemma for AQUALUNG at the time was we hadn't even gotten our IND approved yet, nor had we started our phase 1 study in healthy human volunteers. So you saw the FDA really sort of double down, and everybody tried to repurpose already approved drugs. And that's what you do during a pandemic. But I do think, to directly answer your question, our whole timeline was absolutely accelerated based on the consistent interaction with the FDA, the feedback we received from them. And quite frankly, we got started with our phase 1 human trial 6 months even before we actually had the IND approved by the FDA.
So glad to hear that, particularly when we think about, as we mentioned, certainly with the folks who are on extended ventilation during the height of the pandemic. I mean, not good. And to think about having, something in the armamentarium that can address that from the ARDS perspective is, a game changer across the board. I want to go back to something that you did mention, though, with respect to precision medicine, because a lot of what we talk about, or we're talking about right now, is say addressing ARDS in that patient population. But how about the precision side of what you're working on with AQUALUNG? That is interesting to me, and maybe crosswalk it to some specific examples. I'm assuming, Stan, this is beyond just the pulmonary applications.
Absolutely. No. So when AQUALUNG speaks to our platform technology, typically that can be derived from many different definitions, but we call our platform technology essentially 3 components. One is the therapeutic drug, the monoclonal antibody. The second part is a biomarker, which really highlights this protein that's in the blood. It's in all of our blood circulating. It's called ENaPT, nicotinamide phosphoridylyl transferase. And there's a component of ENaPT that has a certain metabolic activity inside the cell, but when it's secreted outside the cell, when there's some sort of injury to the cell, then it's one of the key regulators to drive inflammation and fibrosis. So we believe the second part of the precision medicine is the biomarker component. So we're measuring that in the blood prior to patients being actually on mechanical ventilation, or in other indications such as pulmonary arterial hypertension, cardiac fibrosis, prostate cancer. NAMPT lights up like a Christmas tree in all of these particular indications. Wow. But I think if you're able to truly demonstrate not only efficacy and safety, but demonstrate less days on mechanical ventilation or mortality benefit, then you've proven the pharmacoeconomic component. And that's when you can negotiate with these hospitals, the GPOs, and the BUCA plans to try and maximize the value of your therapeutic as it gets into the clinic.
Going back to, having the companion diagnostic, I think is just brilliant. It's absolutely something when you look at the complete package. Certainly the identification and the treatment and that level of precision medicine and focus that we're talking about, I think it's a critical component and allows for a competitive advantage when you look at, let's just say, positioning. And let me get to that now. I think about pharma and I think about what has to be in the pipeline just for a typical pharma company, and you certainly know this better than I do, to be viable as they move forward. I would assume that there are folks out there in the, let's just say, the big pharma world who've got their eye on you and AQUALUNG. Is that safe to say right now? And what's the interest been out there in the pharma side?
Well, the interest has actually been overwhelmingly good and positive. And part of that is, I think there's so many disease states that are driven by inflammation. And I would say that the number one topic that was discussed at JP Morgan, which is one of the biggest healthcare conferences annually, was fibrosis, right? People are looking at NASH, people are looking at kidney fibrosis. And so fibrosis writ large is a very, very common area. They're clearly looking for something that has a very potent anti-inflammatory properties that can be used for patients non-responsive to current therapies for Crohn's and ulcerative colitis. And so we see great potential. And for that reason, we're in discussions with pharma, and it's not just about the ARDS indication or the acute indication of ARDS, but also spanning that spectrum of, boy, a drug like ALT-100 can really target 8 different disease states, and of which many of them are already funded, and we have proof of concept in 10 published papers in various indications such as inflammatory bowel disease, as I mentioned earlier, prostate cancer, radiation-induced lung fibrosis. All of these, we have published manuscripts, strong bodies of preclinical data supported by NIH grants. And so we feel like we're in a very strong, compelling position.
Let me throw in there regulatory. Are you tracking where you want to be on both where you are through the phase process as well as regulatory?
We are. In fact, we're getting aggressive like we were when we jumped to the front of the line when we wanted to initiate our phase 1 study in healthy human volunteers. We are meeting with the FDA sometime by mid-May. We call it an end of phase 1 meeting where we will share the whole body of evidence from our healthy human volunteer study. We had zero, I say again, zero serious adverse events. The drug is very, very safe. And so we're not concerned. So we anticipate screening patients in Australia by June. And then we will also be hopefully screening patients and dosing patients sometime in the September timeframe in the United States. We're doing our chronic studies in small and large animals and finalizing our subcutaneous version of this drug as well. And so within the next 12 months, we anticipate filing an IND for our 2 lead chronic indications, which are pulmonary arterial hypertension, which is a significant unmet medical need, and also radiation-induced pneumonitis and fibrosis for lung cancer patients who are receiving radiotherapy.
Tremendous work, and congratulations on hitting those milestones. And to get support from the FDA and recognizing, the applications in so many different ways is also a real positive. I'm sure that you just feel that much more confident about the journey that you're on.
Absolutely.
Your experience, obviously, in the C-suite of very large pharma companies and biotech companies, and now working with essentially a pharma startup, your perspective from discovery to commercialization is a tremendous source of really important information and insight that I want to make sure our listeners, many of who are in the startup space, get to benefit from. And along those lines, Stan, think about the critical milestones that a startup pharma or biotech company should focus on. Where do you start and how do you make sure that happens? I want to pivot the conversation now a little bit more along those lines.
Boy, that's a, there's a lot to unpack actually in that question. As simple as it sounds, there's actually a lot there. It all begins with just the scientific idea, right? And many have great ideas, but even getting that first proof of principle started, it can be a challenge. And so I think from my perspective, having been with some other nascent startup companies, right, it fortunately gave me an ability to. My background is more commercial oriented. I mean, I love sales. I love every aspect of sales, especially when it comes to pharma and biotech, marketing as well. But I think the beauty of being with nascent companies at certain points in my career, you have the ability to see everything. So you get to see the regulatory component. You can sit in on those meetings when regulatory and clinical are talking to the FDA, whereas typically in a large pharma company, that's a focused group of people. You know, they have thousands and thousands of employees, but when you're in a nascent company, you're wearing many different hats. You do need some experience in manufacturing, in regulatory, in clinical development. You have to understand what a total product plan really looks like so you can begin crafting your story to potential investors. You have to have publications. You have to have the scientific thesis. And so I don't want to say it's just one little piece, because I think if I'm advising someone that is sort of in my shoes, I would say certainly try and take advantage of non-dilutive capital. If it's an early program, and try and get some funding to prove your proof of principle with the NIH. But then you have to make sure that you get published articles, you know, peer-reviewed published articles validating the scientific thesis. Because then when you want to start talking to the institutional investors, they want to know that this has been validated. It's not just data on file. And then you have to have a very clearly defined regulatory plan. Manufacturing is the biggest hiccup that can happen to all of these early stage companies, whether it's small molecule or, in our case, a monoclonal antibody. I mean, look, even a great company like Lilly just got a complete response letter with their new biologic indicating that, you know, they're delaying this due to manufacturing issues, right? When you're a small company, I don't care what role you're in, you're living and breathing every day to meet with potential investors to just get the appropriate capital to move the product forward.
Yeah. And that was my next question. It really was aligned to, not that it's chief among them, because I really do believe that certainly this discovery side, the scientific side, there's, as I said, there's got to be a there. But looking, particularly with the raise, you know, different strategies to attract investors. From everything I'm hearing, it's a much tougher environment than it has been in a long, long time. Are you seeing that? And are there different strategies that you're using? And when you think about just the arc of your own career and kind of the challenges that are happening right now in 2023?
Wow. It's definitely a challenge. I'd be remiss if I didn't say that. At the same time, this is typical, right? You know, I can use the hockey analogy, right? It's all about shots on goal, right? And you can talk to one investor sometimes 3 or 4 times, right? And it might be that fourth time where they say, you know what? You've met or exceeded your milestones from when we first met each other. So you know what? I think I'm going to give this another look now. In the instance of AQUALUNG, I think what's important, and if you're sharing this with other people who may be looking to have startup companies, I think you really have to be focused on when you look at institutional venture capital groups, it's what is their passion? Because some might be specific to oncology, some might be specific to immunology, some might be CAR T therapy, you know, gene therapy. It just depends. So what we've done is we've taken a little bit of a different approach. And part of that is because our capital raise isn't $40-50 million as part of our Series A. We're looking for a $10 million Series A, and we're almost halfway there. But what we're looking at is investors that want to put $1 to $2 million in, as opposed to that check writer that typically looks at 40 million or 50 million. We'll need them for the Series B, and we would like that. But I think you just have to be prudent, and you just have to understand the dynamics of the market right now. And so in our instance, it's about finding either mid-sized or smaller institutional venture capital groups that have that type of check size, and they're appreciative of the therapeutic area that we're working on. And then I think you align those two things together, and then you can get your 10 million in 1 to 2 million tranches. It may be more investors as opposed to just one singular or two entities writing that check. But in our instance, thus far, it has been a working strategy that has been good for us as a company to date.
Yeah, that's what came to mind. I mean, it's intentional, right? It's strategically intentional, and probably the wrong way to characterize it, but it's right-sized, perhaps to the sentiment that's out there right now as you look at investors and the appetites that are associated, I think, with the current environment. Let me pivot just a little bit and again take advantage of your experience. When you think about everything changing across the board with respect to the landscape in the health sector, what do you see as the most significant trends and innovations that are popping up in the next, let's just say, 5 to 10 years? If you had your kind of crystal ball.
I mean, data right now, and everyone uses that term AI and artificial intelligence a bit loosely, right? But I look at it from a biotech and pharma perspective in two different ways. So one is we have more data today than we can imagine. And I know, Rick, you have tremendous experience with GPOs as an example, and as the CEO of a health system, but we have more access to data now in patient data, especially hospitalized patient data, than we know what to do with, right? I mean, you can have just multiple runs of different type of data to look at specific cohorts of patients. And I think that, coupled with just when you look at the genome, right? I mean, look, it was how many billions of dollars back in 1970, I think was the date, when it was the human genome was sequenced. And right now it's probably between $200 and $300, right? So the computerized elements of that from a drug development standpoint, now these companies can just look at thousands and thousands of targets and run them through computer analogs and computer programs, where all of a sudden, you're not looking at just one potential target that sort of rises to the top. You could be looking at thousands, right? And so it does two things. It significantly accelerates the drug development timeline, but it also increases the probability of success of the right target as well. So I think the genome piece and all of that, then coupled with large databases, right? When you start culling all of these various databases of disease states, I think the two of those combined as part of a broader constellation of artificial intelligence, I think is really going to drive rapid change in acceleration in novel drug development and targets. It's going to speed the time of drug development and getting drugs across the finish line. And we're going to be going after targets that were at one time thought of as impossible.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot we could learn from the consumer space. First of all, the acquisition of consumer-related information, data, which can inform, it's a proxy for patient-reported outcomes, but I think consumer data plays a big part also in understanding personas, profiles, applications, use cases. And then I agree with you. I think risk-based structures, warranties, I mean, there are places for novel ways to approach it from a business perspective that I think would allow perhaps a little bit more of the innovation from a business modeling to come in and ultimately create an incentive for folks to pursue more on the discovery side, take more chances, more risks. I guess.
Agree.
So Stan, let me just wrap it up with one bigger question. As a seasoned professional, an expert certainly in in the sector, in the biomedtech pharma area. What advice would you give to new startups and perhaps more specifically with aspiring executives or entrepreneurs who are in the field? What do they have to look forward to? What are the challenges and what insights can you share?
The future is extremely bright for all startup companies. But at the same time, I think that they have to also, you can have a great idea, but I think one of the most important things is to make sure that you have the right team around you to provide the insight to get you to those next value inflection points. You can be a great scientist, you can be a great business person, but sometimes the two are not married, for example, when it comes to starting an early stage biotech or a medical device company. And so it is about trying to make sure that you have the right people. You're only going to be as strong as your weakest link. I know these are cliches, but in the end, I think what's been such a great, I'll call it a marriage between myself and the founder of AQUALUNG, is it's a very symbiotic relationship. He's a brilliant physician scientist. He's passionate about this target, this therapy, and he's on a mission to save lives. Certainly as a critical care, pulmonary critical care physician, he's treated thousands of patients with ARDS, and before he hangs up his cleats, he wants to get this across the finish line. But it was really the ability for us to come together and me saying to him, let me take the ball and run with it. Let me work on manufacturing. Let me work on the clinical development. Let me work on the regulatory strategy. Let me work on the total product profile. Let me help with the investor side of this. And I think if everybody stays in their swim lane, I bring in, and we both bring in the additional resources as needed to move the needle. That's what's necessary. And I would just say that you have to be as resilient as they come. And in the biotech world, everybody talks about the valley of death and, you live for another day. It's when will that next tranche of investment capital come in, or when will that next grant hit? At the end of the day, you just have to realize that it's a challenge. And, many biotech companies, especially in the last quarter, have had to close their doors. They've had to downsize. They've had to do a lot of things in order to stay afloat. And AQUALUNG's no different, right? We've had to certainly be stringent and very frugal and be very focused on where we deploy our capital. But in the end, I think it's about just making sure that you have the right people on the team that can get you across the finish line, and just be as resilient as you possibly can.
Well said, my friend. There is always a time and place, and I think you are at that time and in that place. So, Stan, this has been a wonderful conversation, tremendous insights that you've shared with us, the update on AQUALUNG, so much to look forward to. We're going to have you back so we can get an update in a few months and see where things are at. But in the meantime, thank you so much for being on the Healthcare Nation podcast, Stan.
Well, thank you, Rick, and good luck with the Healthcare Nation podcast. It's off and running, and I'm super excited for you as well and really appreciate this opportunity.
The opinions expressed by the host and guests are for informational purposes only and not associated with any companies or academic institutions. Please follow us wherever you listen to your podcasts, as well as our YouTube channel, Healthcare Nation Podcast. And if you have any questions or want to contact us, please reach out to healthcarenationpodcast.com.